The old fishing shack at the edge of Millhaven Creek smelled like rust and river water, and something else, something alive. Becca didn't mean to go that far. She'd only been cutting through the county land behind the Dollar General because Ruth Ann Draper had called her second-hand coat ugly in front of the whole lunch line, and Becca couldn't cry in front of people. She never let herself cry in front of people, so she'd walked and kept walking until the gravel path turned to mud, and the mud turned to cattails, and the cattails opened up into this forgotten stretch of creek bank where nobody ever came. She was 11 years old, and she was very good at disappearing. The shack was the kind of place adults warned you about: sagging roof, one wall half collapsed, kudzu eating the rest. Becca had walked past it a dozen times before without stopping, but today something made her stop. A sound, low and rhythmic, like someone knocking on a door from the inside of a wall. She told herself it was probably a raccoon. She told herself that for almost 3 full minutes before she pushed open the warped wooden door. The man was on the floor in the corner, wrists zip-tied behind him, ankles bound with electrical cord, a strip of duct tape across his mouth. His suit jacket, expensive, the kind Becca had only ever seen in the window of the department store downtown, was torn at the shoulder. There was dried blood at his temple. His eyes, when they found her face, went wide with something that wasn't quite hope yet, something more desperate than hope. Becca stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then she said, "Okay, don't freak out." She wasn't sure if she was saying it to him or to herself. Her name was Rebecca Lynn Colson, but everyone called her Becca except her grandmother Hattie, who called her baby girl, even though Becca had asked her to stop 3 times. She and Hattie lived in a single wide on the far side of town, the one with the broken porch step that Hattie kept meaning to fix and never did. Becca's mother had left when Becca was 4. Her father had never been part of the picture. Hattie worked the early shift at the nursing home 6 days a week and came home smelling like antiseptic and cafeteria gravy, and she'd fall asleep in her recliner before the evening news was halfway done. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and Hattie made sure Becca knew that was the thing that counted. Becca was the kind of child who read library books until the spines cracked and helped the elderly man next door drag his garbage bins to the curb every Tuesday without being asked. She was quiet in the way that made teachers forget to call on her, and loud in the way that mattered. She'd once stood up in the middle of a 7th grade assembly and told the vice principal he'd mispronounced the word particularly 3 times in a row. He hadn't appreciated that. Becca had not apologized. She'd found a pocket knife in the creek bed 2 summers ago and kept it in her jacket pocket ever since, not because she planned to use it on anything, but because it made her feel less small in a world that was always trying to remind her how small she was. It was that knife she reached for now. The man flinched when she came toward him. She stopped. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said. "I'm 11. Calm down." He went still. She could see him breathing through his nose, fast and shallow. "I'm going to cut the cord on your feet first," she said, "and then you have to promise not to kick me when I do the tape." He nodded. His eyes were gray. She noticed that because she was the kind of person who noticed things, the electrical cord was tougher than it looked. She had to saw at it for a good 2 minutes, and her hand was cramping by the end, but it gave. She worked on the zip ties next. Those were harder, and she ended up having to find the seam and work the blade under it sideways, the way Hattie had shown her once for a stuck package. When his hands came free, he shook them out slowly, and she could see the marks on his wrists where the plastic had cut in. She peeled the tape back carefully. He made a sound she'd rather not think about. "Thank you," he said. His voice was rough from disuse or thirst or both. "What's your name?" "Becca." She sat back on her heels and looked at him. Up close, she could see he was older than she'd first thought, maybe 50, maybe more. His hair was silver at the temples, and his face had the particular kind of lines that came not from age but from a long time spent being responsible for things. "What's yours, Lawrence?" he said. And then, because old habits apparently survived kidnapping, "Lawrence Alderton." Becca didn't recognize the name. She would later understand that most people in Millhaven County would have. Lawrence Alderton was the kind of man whose name appeared on the side of buildings, whose face showed up in the business section of newspapers, whose company employed roughly a quarter of the working adults in 3 surrounding counties. He'd built Alderton Industrial from a single machine shop into a manufacturing enterprise worth several $100 million. And he had done it, people said, by being the hardest working and the most stubborn man in any room he walked into. Right now he could barely sit upright on a rotting shack floor. "How long have you been here?" Becca asked. He thought about it. "Since Tuesday night." It was Thursday afternoon. "Did you eat anything?" "They left water." He said it without inflection, like he'd already processed the humiliation of it and set it aside. 2 bottles. Becca reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the granola bar she'd been saving since lunch. It was slightly bent. She held it out and ate it in 4 bites and didn't say anything. But something in the way he looked at her afterward was different. Softer, like a door that had been locked for a long time opening just a crack. "I need to call someone," he said. "My grandma's phone has minutes," Becca said. "But she's at work. I can take you to the gas and go. They'll let you use the phone if you ask nice." She paused. "Do you think you can walk?" He could walk, though not fast. They made it out of the shack and onto the path, and then the gravel road, Becca matching her pace to his, neither of them talking much. She noticed he kept glancing behind them. She understood, in the way that children who'd grown up with precarious things understood, that whatever had put him in that shack was probably not finished with him. She also understood, without quite being able to say why, that she was going to help him anyway. The man at the gas and go counter, Derek, according to his name tag, stared at Lawrence Alderton for a long moment before silently passing the phone across the counter. Lawrence made 2 calls. The first was short and to a number he knew by heart. The second was longer, quieter, and he turned away from Becca while he made it. She bought a Gatorade with the quarters she found in her jacket lining and waited on the bench outside. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the lot. 2 men in dark jackets got out. Then a woman in her 30s, dark hair pulled back, wearing the expression of someone who had been terrified for 2 days and was only now beginning to let herself breathe. She crossed the parking lot at a pace that was almost running and wrapped her arms around Lawrence Alderton like she was trying to keep him from dissolving. "Dad," Becca heard her say. Just that. Just the word. Lawrence held onto her daughter, his daughter, and closed his eyes. After a moment, he looked over her shoulder at Becca, who was sitting on the bench watching, Gatorade in hand, doing a decent job of pretending she wasn't. "Come here," he said. "Please." Becca came. "This is Vanessa," he said, when his daughter had pulled back enough to let him speak. "My daughter." He looked at Vanessa. "This young woman found me. She got me out." Vanessa looked at Becca. Her eyes were red. She seemed to not quite know what to do with what she was feeling, and then she bent down and hugged Becca, which Becca had not been expecting at all. Becca stood very still with her arms at her sides for a moment, and then, almost without deciding to, she hugged back. "Thank you," Vanessa said. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Becca said, "You're welcome," because Hattie had raised her to say you're welcome. Hattie Colson had a radar for trouble that had taken 63 years to develop and was now essentially infallible. When she got home from her shift and found 2 men in dark jackets sitting in her living room and a strange woman at her kitchen table and her granddaughter eating a sandwich in the middle of all of it, looking entirely too calm about everything, Hattie said, "Becca Lynn," in a voice that contained an entire conversation's worth of meaning. "I found someone," Becca said. "He needed help." Hattie looked at Lawrence Alderton, who had cleaned up somewhat and was sitting in Hattie's good chair, looking like a man who had not quite reconnected with the fact that he was safe. She looked at the 2 dark-jacketed men. She looked at Vanessa, who had the red-eyed look of someone for whom this day had been too much. "Anyone need more coffee?" Hattie said. That was Hattie. She led with coffee. Questions came after. The questions, when they did come, she aimed at Lawrence while Becca was supposedly doing homework at the kitchen table, which meant Becca was doing homework while also listening to every word. He told them some of it. Not all. The men who had taken him, he said, were connected to a business dispute that had turned ugly. A former partner who'd felt cheated when Lawrence bought him out 3 years prior. He'd been snatched from the parking structure below his office building on Tuesday evening. They'd meant to hold him for ransom, he thought, though no demand had come through, possibly because Vanessa had gone to the police almost immediately, and things had gotten complicated for whoever was behind it. He was lucky, he said. He knew he was lucky. Hattie listened to all of this with her hands folded around her coffee mug. When he was finished, she looked at him for a moment with the patient, assessing look she used on difficult residents at the nursing home. "You're going to eat dinner with us," she said, "and then Vanessa can take you wherever you need to go." It wasn't a question. Lawrence looked at her for a moment, and then something shifted in his face, something like relief, or gratitude, or maybe just the recognition of being in the presence of someone who kept the world steady. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Hattie made chicken and dumplings. Becca set the table. It was a Thursday night like other Thursday nights, except that it wasn't, and all of them knew it. Lawrence sent flowers the next day. An enormous arrangement that barely fit through the door of the single wide, with a card that said, "Thank you" in handwriting that was cramped and slightly sideways. Hattie put them on the kitchen counter and looked at them for a long time. The week after that, a letter arrived. It was from Alderton Industrials Foundation. Becca didn't know companies had foundations, though she looked it up later. And it stated that a college scholarship fund had been established in the name of Rebecca Lynn Colson, sufficient to cover 4 years at any accredited university in the country. Hattie sat down at the kitchen table when she read it. She pressed her hand flat against the page like she needed to make sure it was real. Becca was not sure what to feel. She was 11. College was a long way away. But she looked at Hattie's face, the way some long-held tension in it had released, the way she looked younger for a moment, and then very, very tired in the way that people looked when they finally allowed themselves to stop bracing. And she felt something large and wordless move through her. "Grandma," she said. Hattie looked up. Her eyes were bright. "I told you we had each other," Hattie said. "Didn't I tell you that?" "You tell me that all the time," Becca said. "Well," Hattie folded the letter carefully along its original creases. "I was right." Lawrence Alderton did not simply send flowers and letters and move on. That wasn't who he was, or rather, it wasn't who he was trying to become in the months that followed. He called Hattie once a week at first, then Becca directly once. Hattie had decided that was all right. He asked about school, about the books Becca was reading, about Hattie's work. He did not make it feel like charity, which was a harder thing to do than most people understood. He came to Millhaven twice that fall. The first time to meet with the county sheriff about the ongoing investigation. 2 arrests had been made, though the former partner himself was still technically at large. The second time he brought Vanessa, and they all had dinner at the one decent restaurant in town, and Vanessa and Becca talked for most of the meal about a television show they both watched and the particular frustration of watching fictional characters make obviously wrong decisions. "She's something," Vanessa told her father in the car afterward. "I know," Lawrence said. "You look at her like." Vanessa paused. "I don't know. Like something." Lawrence didn't answer right away. He watched the dark countryside go past the window. He thought about what Vanessa wasn't quite saying, and what he hadn't quite let himself say out loud yet. He had a daughter, a grown woman, brilliant and capable, and the best thing in his life. But there had been another child once, a son, born small and early, who had lived for 6 days before he didn't. Lawrence and his wife, long divorced, different lives now, had never talked about it much. Some grief was too structural to discuss. You just built around it and moved on. He wasn't sure why Becca made him think of it. She didn't look like anyone. She was her own particular person, angular and sharp-eyed and entirely unbothered by things that were supposed to be intimidating. She'd found a man bound in an abandoned shack, and her first instinct had been to get out her pocket knife. He didn't think she understood yet how rare that was. The instinct to help first, to be afraid later. He hoped she'd never lose it. Winter came to Millhaven County with the particular gray stubbornness of a Midwestern November. The broken porch step finally gave way completely, and Becca caught Hattie favoring her ankle for 3 days before she admitted she'd turned it bad on the way out one morning. Becca taped it up with the first aid kit from under the sink and told Hattie she needed to call the property manager, and Hattie said the property manager never answered, and Becca said then they needed to fix it themselves. They spent a Saturday afternoon doing exactly that, Hattie directing from a lawn chair because of her ankle, Becca following a YouTube tutorial on her phone and wielding a hammer with great concentration. The new step wasn't perfect. It was a little crooked, and the wood was slightly the wrong shade of gray, but it held. Lawrence called that evening and Becca told him about the step, and he laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and asked if she needed him to send anyone, and Becca said they'd handled it, thank you, and she could hear in the pause that followed that he was pleased by this in a way he didn't quite know how to articulate. "You know," he said, "I have a meeting in your area in December. Vanessa's going to be with me. I thought maybe we could come by, if that's all right with Hattie." "I'll ask her," Becca said. Hattie said, "Tell him yes, and tell him I'm making pie." The December visit was different from the others. There was a quality to it that Becca, who read enough books to have a word for most things, might have called weight. Not uncomfortable weight, more like the feeling a room had when everyone in it knew something important was about to be said. It didn't come until after dinner, after the pie, after Vanessa and Hattie had drifted into a long conversation about the nursing home and what Vanessa's mother, Lawrence's ex-wife, whom Lawrence referred to simply as Carol, in the brief and neutral way of people who have long since made their peace, had gone through at the end of her life. Becca was loading the dishwasher, and Lawrence was leaning against the counter, and they were, for once, quiet together. "I want to ask you something," Lawrence said, "and I want you to know that whatever you say is the right answer." Becca closed the dishwasher and looked at him. "I'm on the board of the Hollingsworth Academy," he said. Becca knew the name. It was the private school in the city, the one with the art building that looked like a spaceship. "They have a full residential program. It's a remarkable place for kids who—" He stopped, started again. "For kids who are curious, who read, who fix porch steps with YouTube tutorials." Becca was quiet. "I've already spoken with Hattie about the possibility," he said. "She wanted to hear what you thought before she said anything. What did she say to you?" Becca asked. Lawrence smiled a little. She said, "Lawrence, if you're asking what I think you're asking, you'd better ask her yourself." Outside, it had started to snow, the first real snow of the season coming down slow, and even past the kitchen window. She thought about her school, with its buzzing fluorescent lights and the teacher who forgot to call on her. She thought about the library books with cracked spines. She thought about the pocket knife in her jacket pocket, and what it meant to her and why. "Hattie would come visit," she said, "whenever she wanted, and you'd be home for every break." He paused. "This isn't about taking you away from her. I need you to know that." "I know," Becca said, and she did. She understood, more than most 11-year-olds would have, more than she should have had to, but she did, that what Lawrence was offering was not pity and not charity and not even exactly gratitude. It was recognition, the specific and serious recognition of one person by another. She had seen him when no one else had, and he was, in his careful, slightly sideways way, trying to see her back. "Okay," she said. "Okay. Yeah." She looked out at the snow. "Okay." There was a moment later that night, after Lawrence and Vanessa had gone, and Hattie was washing the pie dish and Becca was at the table with a book she wasn't really reading, when Hattie said, without turning around, "You're still mine, you know." Becca looked up. "Wherever you go," Hattie said. "Whatever happens." "You're still mine." Becca had been told a lot of things in her 11 years. Teachers had told her she was smart. Ruth Ann Draper had told her coat was ugly. The universe, in its large and impersonal way, had told her repeatedly that she was small, and her circumstances were small, and she should expect small things. Nobody had ever said it quite like that. "You're still mine," not as a claim, as a fact. The kind of fact that didn't require proof or argument or any evidence at all. It simply was, the same way the creek was, the same way the snow was, the same way certain things were true before you were old enough to have words for them. "I know, Grandma," Becca said. Hattie set the dish in the rack. She dried her hands on the kitchen towel. She came over and kissed the top of Becca's head. "Good," she said. "Now go to bed. You've got school." The investigation concluded in February. The former partner, a man named Gerald Soames, who had apparently been nursing his resentment through 3 years of mediocre subsequent ventures, was arrested at an airport in Phoenix, trying to catch a flight under a name that wasn't his. The 2 men who'd held Lawrence were sentenced. The whole thing was written up in the business papers, and in the coverage there was a brief mention of a young girl who discovered Mr. Alderton and freed him. No name, at Lawrence's request. Becca read the article at the school library on a Thursday morning. She read it twice. Then she folded the printout and put it in her jacket pocket, next to the pocket knife. She thought about the man on the shack floor, the way his eyes had found her face. The way hope looked when it was almost too far gone to recognize itself. She thought, I was just cutting through. And then she thought, maybe that's the thing about it. You're cutting through. And then suddenly, you're not. You're there. She started at Hollingsworth in September. The art building did look like a spaceship up close. Her roommate was a girl named Temperance, who went by Tempe and had opinions about everything, and wasn't even slightly put off by the fact that Becca also had opinions about everything, which was a relief. Her English teacher had read every book Becca had ever read, and several hundred she hadn't, and their third class together turned into a 40-minute argument about narrative unreliability that the teacher said was the best classroom moment she'd had in 5 years. Hattie called every Sunday. Lawrence called once a month, always on the first Monday, always at 7 in the evening, always with a question he'd clearly been saving, about a class, about a book, about what she thought of some news story he'd been puzzling over. Vanessa texted occasionally, usually links to articles about things they'd talked about over dinner. It wasn't a family, exactly. Becca already had a family. It was something adjacent to that, something that didn't quite have a name, which Becca thought was fine. Not everything needed naming. What it was people who showed up, consistently, quietly, in their different ways, people who saw her and didn't look away. Becca had spent most of her life learning how to disappear. She was starting now to learn something else. She wasn't sure yet what to call it, but it felt, in the particular way of things that mattered, like the beginning of something she'd been walking toward for a very long time. Through the cattails down the creek bank to the door of a sagging shack at the edge of everything she'd ever known. She'd pushed the door open, and on the other side, this